Hello, everybody. It's been quite a while since we've met together. Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, we thank you for the privilege of being alive at this moment in Earth's history. I ask that you would guide, direct, and bless, and that the Holy Spirit would guide and direct us through this series of meetings. Be with us and bless us. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Sorry, I thought that was going to get translated. That's why there was a delay. I have two presentations this weekend. And I wanted to do some revision and some reminders of what has already been taught. So before I begin, I want to say that I'm going to be doing a presentation based upon Acts 27. And I also want to acknowledge that I got quite a bit of help in putting this together. From one of the competent and very knowledgeable Bible workers in Zimbabwe. So I wanted to just draw some lines. You're all familiar with these. So this is the line of the 144,000. All relatively straightforward. I've asked for the chat to be switched off. I normally would like to have it on, but if we have it on, then we'll have too many people responding. So I'm having to do this all by myself. So we'll now draw the line of the priests. And this is where we get problems because it all gets squashed up. And then the Levites. and then the Nethinims. So I apologize that it's out of scale. So we're familiar with these lines, intimately familiar. And you all are familiar and understand how we cascade these waymarks through these histories. So this would be the Sunday law. Sunday law. Sunday law. And then you have the close of probation for each of those groups. So the reason I drew these is because within the movement, there's a burning question that everybody is having. And that question is, if we are in this history over here, I'll put a star here. First of all, it looks like our line has finished. And then the question is, where are the Levites? So I think people are concerned, are worried that there are no Levites joining us. And if there are no Levites joining us, what will happen when we get to this history here for the Nethinims? So I'm not saying that I have an answer to this dilemma, but I think it would be interesting if people wanted to private message me and tell me, where are the Levites? Why are they not joining us? So I want to say, don't give me the following answer. The reason there are no Levites coming is because there are sinners in the camp. Or the movement is in rebellion. Or it's in a Laodicean condition. So those three situations that I spoke of are really a singular issue. That there's some kind of failure in the movement. Oh, there's one more I didn't add, sorry. Don't blame me. By which I mean, don't blame the leadership. I don't believe that the reason that there are no Levites coming in is because of a failure by the institution of this movement or individuals? So if you try to give me your thoughts, your feedback over the next 24 hours, when we meet tomorrow, we'll have a short discussion about what people's thoughts and ideas are. Oh, there's one more. I forgot. There's another one. There are lots of negative reasons. We made a mistake. So that's a reason that people might think that maybe we've gone wrong somewhere. Which is why we want to have a brief discussion about Acts 27. Now, I know today there are many people in the movement that don't really go into Daniel and Revelation. I don't know if people are studying it privately, but there are very few studies that I am aware of where people are speaking about those two books. Several years ago, we'll say before the midnight cry, the books of Daniel and Revelation were studied exhaustively. And one of the key passages for me personally, one of the anchor visions was Daniel chapter 2. And if you look at Daniel chapter 2, it's clear that there is a movement that is created by God's hand, by God's power, that is taken from the church. The church of Laodicea, the mountain of Daniel 2. And when you start taking that model and then you overlay Acts 27 on top, we say Acts 27, but it includes chapter 28 as well, of course. And then when you take Ellen White's writings, particularly early writings and the Great Controversy, you begin to see that the picture that develops is one that indicates there is more than this initial movement that will complete the work of God. Ellen White is clear that there are people who are changing and reforming their lives, people in God's church, right up to the Sunday law. So we have plenty of evidence that there are going to be more people than are part of this movement. And then, of course, when you go to the book of Ezra, and you look at that history, and you look at Chronicles and Kings, you see that in the history of Hezekiah, which is found in Chronicles and Kings, that when they want to restore the work of the temple, that work cannot be accomplished by priests on their own. The Levites have to join them. And we all know that the Levites are a consecrated group who are set apart for holy work, just as the priests. And then when you overlay that story with Ezra, and I want to remind us that the book of Ezra and the story that we've just spoken about are not happening at the same time. They're different histories. But we're using a familiar technique where we're taking a symbol from one history and then using the same symbol in another history and projecting one on top of the other or overlaying them. So as soon as you have priests and Levites restoring the temple, then you can take those two symbols, go into Ezra, and you can discover the Nethinims. That's a really brief review of how those three groups were created. Or discovered, depending on how you conceptualize it. And I want to remind us that when the temple was being restored, the priests from Jerusalem, they were helped by people from all over Israel. The more detailed you look at in various stories, the more evidence you have that there are indeed two groups in Adventism. Those we call the priests and the Levites. So the question is, why are the Levites not joining us? As I say, even though I don't have an answer, one thing that I am certain about, that there isn't a negative reason, a failure of members, leadership, or this institution. And if that's the case, then what's been shown to us, because we're living through this history right now, is that we must have a misunderstanding of the application. The Bible speaks and tells us that spiritual things must be spiritually discerned. And you're all familiar with the very simple rule that we have used many times in the past. Local, literal, worldwide, spiritual. So we now live in a time period, in a dispensation, where things need to be understood spiritually. And what I believe has happened is that we have taken, correctly so, many portions of inspiration spiritually. But we've held on to, I want to call it, some baggage. And that baggage is something that's been with us for a long time. It's that we're still inclined to see things literally. So the misunderstanding that we have about our models here is not that the structures are wrong. It's that the application that we're making of those structures isn't correct. And I think the reason it's not correct is because we have taken things literally. And when we do that, we can end up coming to wrong conclusions, and we can become disappointed. Now, if we have misunderstood the line of the Levites in application, then you can be certain that we've already misunderstood the line of the Nethinims. I want to encourage each of you to go back to the passages in those two books I mentioned. I'm going to jump forward a bit in our study. In Acts 27:28, when Paul is shipwrecked, he's on the island of, the Bible calls it Melita, but we call it Malta. And what does he begin to do there? He begins to minister to the people. Now, I think we're all familiar with that story enough. To understand that those people on that island are Gentiles, and we identify them as the Nethinims. Now, the reason why that is significant is on this big line here, line of the 144,000, we're in this history here, where Paul is ministering to the islanders of Malta. Now, when you go to early writings or more fully explaining great controversy, we know that it's in the Sunday law history that the church goes to the world and harvests it. So the story in the book of Acts is a confirmation, or we could say Ellen White is a confirmation of the book of Acts, of this line. Now, Ellen White does not make this application. We're making this. And what's so important about Acts 27, when we project that onto the great controversy narrative, we're at the close of probation, and Ellen White will tell you that at the close of probation, we run to the mountains. We stop our ministry, the ministry to the world. So you can go to Daniel 2 and see this same story laid out. It's a very high level story, so it doesn't go into many details. So it's going to merge the Sunday law history and the time of trouble history, those last two dispensations. But it clearly tells you that the stone in Daniel 2 the imagery changes to a threshing instrument for harvest. And as the imagery changes to a threshing instrument, the statue changes also to a crop, a grain. So the wheat is threshed and separated. And then it switches back to the statue and the statue is destroyed. So Daniel 2 covers the Sunday law history and the time of trouble, or the close of probation history. Going back to what Ellen White says, at the close of probation, we flee to the mountains. And the reason we're fleeing Often we want to give a positive spin or a positive idea on our reasons. In fact, Ellen White indicates that we're patting ourselves on the back, we've done a good job, and now our work is finished and we will leave. But of course, we have a very powerful story in the life and history of Elijah. Because at this very point here, close of probation, Elijah is going to go to Jezreel. That's a city. And he's going to be confronted with Jezebel. And in fear, he flees from her because of her wrath. And when you read the story that follows, in this history here, Elijah knows he's failed and he wants God to destroy him. And when Ellen White comments on that history, she agrees that Elijah has failed in his mission. Because of fear. Now, I want to remind us how our brains are constructed, our minds. There's the fast brain and the slow brain. And unless you're familiar with this, I'm going to call it a scientific fact. When you read inspiration, it's very easy to come to wrong conclusions. And often we don't understand God's mercy. Instead of killing Elijah, God feeds Elijah. Because he's come to his senses. Came to his right mind. If you don't understand how the human mind works, fast brain, slow brain, you will not understand why God is making those decisions. It's not because God is merciful on Elijah or turns a blind eye, but the human being Elijah is created in the image of God. Which means that God has a fast brain and a slow brain. And God understands clearly what Elijah didn't. That Elijah, at the close of probation, had gone into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And flight means to run, in case translators don't know. The natural response of a human being. So God is working with that human being's humanity It's not a sin problem in the classic way that we would normally understand it. Which brings us back to Acts 27. When you get to this point here, which is indicated on the line of the Nethinims, the end of their line, and this is where the Nethinims are going to be ministered to. In this story, we would call this the time of trouble, or we would call it the harvest. We often refer to it as Jacob's time of trouble. Where, like Elijah, he wrestles with God. But in Acts 27, Paul is taken away by force. Rome forces him to leave the island. So he no longer has access to the people of Malta. The people of Malta are the Nethinims. So their ministry, or the ministry to them, must come to an end. And I think it's important for us to understand that connection. That we have this line of evidence that helps us to establish that the model of harvest is the correct one. And so that the work for the Nethinims must come to its completion at the close of probation, according to Acts 27. So there is no mistake in these lines. Now, I'm sure that based upon our reading of inspiration, that we're expecting a great work to be done in the Sunday law history as we minister to the Gentiles, to the Nethinims. Based upon that model, we as a movement have taken that model and gone back to the Levites here and we've said we must therefore do a great work for the Levites and harvest them in. But I think we're falling into the trap of literalism. Because we have too much evidence that the structure of these lines is not at fault. So as we have worked back from the Nethinims to the Levites, we can go from the Levites to the Nethinims. So if we've misunderstood the work that's going on in this history, then you can be certain that we're going to misunderstood the work that goes on in this history for the Nephilims. And I want to remind us that in this history, for the priests, there were many misunderstandings about what was happening and what was going on. We know we're in a Laodicean condition. There's so much evidence of that in our movement. And Laodicea, I want to express that experience in the following way. A love for earth more than a love for heaven. And this attraction to earthly things takes on many forms. So how can it be that we've entered into a deep Laodicean condition, and yet according to this line, the priests in this history were harvested? Harvested for heaven. And when that happened, those people who remained in the movement, it's not like that we became holy people and all the people that had left the movement were lost and undone. Because we're talking about this movement now, and we're in this history, and in some ways we're getting worse than better. And the only reason I say we're getting worse is not that we're doing worse things. It's that we're not learning the lessons that we're required to and put them into practice. So the sinfulness of sin seems to grow. And so what was once acceptable today looks totally ugly. To whom much is given, much is required. So we already know that our understanding of harvest, both in the line of the priests and the Levites, has been misunderstood. And therefore, we're misunderstanding the line of the Nephilims. Therefore, we need to take heed to the events that are occurring in the world. So that we can better understand our place in the history of the end of the world. Because it's almost certain that it's not going to be as we expect. I'm sure you'll agree, when we begin to review the lines, the foundation that has been laid for us by Elder Tess is broad and vast. There are so many details, so many elements. It's easy to forget all that has been taught to us. There is just too much information to go into any kind of detail. So I just want to do a basic overview of Acts 27 and just take up one or two points in that story. So perhaps we should first go to the Bible. So we're in Acts 27, and it doesn't say this in verse 1. You have to go to a previous chapter. But Paul is captive in Caesarea. Caesarea is in Israel. So Paul is captive in Caesarea, and he's going to be sent back to Jerusalem to be judged. And we know that Paul is a Roman citizen. And he's going to make a defense that only a Roman can make. He believes he's being unfairly judged. If he was sent back to Jerusalem. So rather than submit to that happening because he knows he will be killed, he speaks to the Roman governor and he appeals to him and says, I want to go to Rome. It was the right of a Roman citizen to have their case taken up by Caesar. In today's language, in today's imagery, Paul was making an appeal to be heard at the Supreme Court. Which is his right. And so in Acts 27, verse 1, he is going to be sent to Italy. So in verse 2, he's going to enter into a ship of Adramyttium. And it says that, people pronounce this differently, Aristarchus, Paul, And it doesn't say, but Luke is with them. There's 3 people on the boat, and they're all going to go to Italy. With other prisoners, verse 1, and a Roman band, a group of soldiers. So I know that we're all familiar with this, but if you look up the word admiritium, the definition of the word, I'll give you 2. I shall abide in death. So I want us to think of, I'm going to live or exist in death. Another definition is the court of death. So it's easy to take that definition and say, because it's a story about Paul, and it's talking about the court, it's easy to imagine that the death that's been spoken of is that of Paul. And if you go to the literal story, that ends up what happens to Paul. He does get killed by a Roman court, Caesar. So the Supreme Court finds him guilty of sedition and sentences him to death. Now, Paul goes to Rome twice. He goes on this journey, stands before Caesar, and he's released. Instead of running away in hiding, he continues to cause trouble. And sometimes later, he is captured and sent back to Rome, where he's executed by the same court. So in the literal story, Paul will abide in death, and he will go to the court of death. Now, if you were to take that surface understanding bring it to the end of the world, you could develop all kinds of stories. The people of God are going to be killed at the end of the world, as the highest courts in the land, Rome, are going to sentence them to death. And of course, that would be a reasonable conclusion to make. But you have to take the whole of the story. And one of the beautiful elements of this study which has a pedigree, has a legacy, because it's not the first time that it's happened, is that within one story, you have a repeat and enlarge. Because if you trace through this story, we're going to say at this moment that there are two ships. There's one from Adramyttium and one from Alexandria. Now I say two, but in fact there are three ships. And upon the testimony of two or three, a thing is established. So what a good priest would do, which is what Elder Tess did, she saw through this story. And rather than being distracted by Paul, who is the theme of this story, literally, she was able to dig deeper and see through that. So Paul is consistent all the way through this story from beginning to end. And while he's woven into this story, because there's only one Paul, we only have a testimony of one. Which means you could not get a repeat and enlarge in this story easily. What you have to do is you have to look at the history of this story. You remember the story or the history of Pyrrhus. Again, it's a single line of history, a single story. But if you start looking in detail, you see that the story is divided into segments. And in that story, the division comes through geographical wars. And you get this same repeat and enlargement. So when you come to Acts 27 and 28, it's the story of the ships that opens the key. They become the focus of attention, or what we would say is the theme of the story. The two cities, Adramyttium and Alexandria, they tell two overlapping stories. And in the ship of Alexandria, there are two ships from the same place. And that becomes an important part of this story, as we all know. So we've seen enough presentations on this story, so I'm not going to go into detail and I'm not going to prove things. And I'm not going to go through all the symbology and demonstrate why those waymarks are where they are. So the ships are on a journey and they make many stops. And in doing so, we can begin to get waymarks for the ship's journeys. So I want us to all be clear on the methodology that is being used. We're taking story after story and putting these various stories on top of one another. So when we come to Acts 27, what we know about this story is it's the story of Paul's life. You can demonstrate on another line that this is at the end of his world. The world as he understands it. This is the end of Jerusalem as it transforms from one entity to another. And Paul lays this out very clearly in the book of Galatians, in the book of Galatians. He speaks about two Jerusalems, one on earth, one in heaven. And the one on earth is going to come to its end. It's the end of the world. So we have good reason to look at the book of Acts, the story of Paul's life, and look for application at the end of the world. As we go from the death of one Jerusalem and the birth of another, a literal one, to a spiritual one, we can take that same modeling and bring it to the end of the world, which is what Daniel 2 does. In the language of Paul, it's two Jerusalems, a mountain and a stone. Mountain and a stone. And the mountain is, we're going to say literal, it's physical, it's visible, you can touch it. When you go to Daniel 2, the stone seems real enough. But Paul is clear that it's a spiritual Jerusalem. Because in that history, you have a separation of church and state. And therefore, the church must be a spiritual entity. It cannot be a physical one. It has to have a different construction than the one that precedes it. In our history, we have the Seventh-day Adventist conference structure. The mountain, literal, physical, it's there. And then you have this spiritual movement. People often ask, what is our name? When are we going to have a name? I would suggest that if you go back to the New Testament, you'll discover that the New Testament church, the Church of God, doesn't have a name. Paul will identify as spiritual Jerusalem, or the heavenly Jerusalem, but he knows very well that he's using that symbolically. There's nothing literal about it. It's nameless. And that's why we don't have a name. Because we don't work on the same legal earthly basis as other organizations. We're a heavenly band, a movement. So we have a strong prophetic ground why we don't have a name. So coming back to Acts 27, we have two ships, and with each of those ships goes through various ports, it moves geographically through time. And as soon as you shift your focus from Paul 1 to the ships 2/3, two ships from two different cities, one pointing to death, ad remitium, judged and found wanting. The court of death. Alexandria, the protector of the people, those who protect the people. So there's one boat, one ship that is the protector of people, and the other one speaks about a death sentence. And because it's two ships, you begin to see the license to repeat and enlarge a story. And it becomes important to understand the methodology that's being employed. It looks simple enough, but it's very sophisticated, and it has a long history. One person, one line, two ships. Divide the story into two. So once you divide that line in two, you know what you're required to do. You overlay them one on top of the other. Repeat and enlarge. This is standard operating procedure, standard methodology for this movement, and it's been so for years. And there are several stories, not that many, but several, you can take one story and divide it into two. Now, the way you divide stories is by looking at context, looking at symbology. Remember, if Paul was the subject of this story, you would not be able to divide it. You would not be able to have a repeat and enlarge. Unless you began to see a clear and distinct division in Paul's experience of what was happening in his life, and there is no such thing in this story. It's a simple story that Paul goes from Caesarea to Rome. A single theme. And it's the boats that are the key to unlocking this story. A death sentence ad remittium. The protector of the people, Alexandria. So we now can establish that we can divide this story into two and overlap them. Now, the second thing we need to be clear about, when you have overlapping stories, sometimes they don't begin or end at the same point. Often they may begin at different points but end at the same, or begin at the same point and end at different points. But something that's common to these stories is that even if they may begin at different times, often you can use symbology to align things correctly. As an example, if we were to go to the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 40, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Have you read it? So what we see is the death of the king of the north, him. And then we see that the king of the north shall fight against him, the king of the south. So there's a contradiction in this story. The king of the north is dead. The word push means to fatally wound. And to overflow and pass over means destruction. So we know that there's a problem in the verse. And to explain that, you just go to the book of Revelation. And the nicest place to go is Revelation 17. So in Revelation 17, it speaks about a beast that dies and gets resurrected. And that beast, we can understand it to be power, enforcement. So it could be police or the courts or the military. There's a resurrection of power. And that's needed because of the person who is riding that beast. The person is riding a dead beast for a while. And therefore, the beast is not supporting or helping that person. In 1140, it says chariots, horsemen, ships, power. So when you bring these stories together, you see there's a resurrection of the king of the north. And when you see that, what you're able to do is to take one story and divide it into two. So the first story begins at the time of the end, and then the king of the north will die. In its death, There's no power. And then it resurrects. And when it resurrects, it will then have power. Revelation 17 explains this story very well. So the question is, when does this happen? That's what's crucial to us. And because you're taking this story and we're going to cut it, we begin to have a clue of when that will happen. We all know the answer. At the time of the end. And because it's at the time of the end and we've cut this story, we can take this line and bring it underneath. So what we would normally do is we would do this. We'll call it 1 and 2. But we know that these don't happen at the same time. It's the symbol that's the same. Now, in this story of Daniel 11, we know the dates. We know that this is 1798. And we know that this is 1989. Now, because we're so used to doing this, we tend to automatically bring the second line and line it directly under the first. But of course, we know that's not how it works in real life. Because there's no time at the end of resurrection at this history. It actually occurs here. In 1989. And so there's a waymark here. When you take this story as you go through. And let me put it where it would be. It would actually be here. So what we can do is take this one line and bring this one underneath, and normally we would place it here. But we know in reality it occurs here. So in this story, this time at the end here, the resurrection actually becomes its own waymark in this story. And unless you're familiar with doing that, it can confuse you. So what we're doing, taking one story. In this story, it's verse 40 and 41. And then we split the verse and we say that there's a time of the end and there's a second time of the end. Death and resurrection. And what we need to be able to do in our minds is take two concepts at the same time. We continue the line. So this is a real waymark in this line. But we can also divide the line and repeat and enlarge. So we can take this portion and it comes all the way underneath and you line up the time of the ends, which is what we tend to often do. But this resurrection, the second time of the end, actually occurs at a different point in history, 1989 and 1798. There's a span of time between them. You need to take both concepts, a continuum and repeat and enlarge, and handle them at the same time. Now we call this the time of the end, but it's actually the beginning. The time of the end can be considered as a point in time and a dispensation. Ellen White's clear on that. She says we are living in the time of the end, not at the time of the end. So the time of the end, the waymark, is the start or the beginning. And that's the argument that we can use in the story of Paul, Acts 27. That there's going to be a start of the journey in Caesarea, where, for our purposes, we're going to say judgment begins. But he's not being judged yet. He's going to the court of death to be judged. So we can mark Caesarea as the time of the end. Now, as we find in this story here, two lines. One time of the end, a symbol, but two different dates or starting points. This is what was found by Elder Tess in Acts 27. That there's one story that's divided and repeated and enlarged. They both start at the time of the end. But the time of the end in each story is different. Just as it is in Daniel 11. So I want us to hold that thought in our mind. And tomorrow we'll continue this discussion. And I'm sure in the meantime, many of you will either review some of these studies or look at the lines to see this. I welcome you to do that. And I've sent you my thoughts on why the Levites are not joining us. And I welcome your thoughts on it. And if I get any feedback from people, I'll share that tomorrow. Okay, I want to thank you all. And let's close with a word of prayer. Holy God, we thank you for all that you have done for us and all that you continue to do for us. In the past, we would say that you have mercy. But the more we understand who you are, through understanding who we are, we realize that you are not just a merciful God, but you're a God of understanding and knowledge. A person who knows and understands our construction. Therefore, you do not overlook our faults and our defects. Sometimes we call them mistakes. But you who constructed us understand how we were made. Help each of us to know ourselves and to understand one another. Help us to have confidence in the structures that have been given to us by the Holy Spirit. We all are kneeling before you, and we want to take a moment to thank you and acknowledge our elder. We ask that you would be with her and strengthen and guide her. And help her too to have confidence in these lines. Help us to understand and remind us how to construct these lines. May we never forget that we are living in a spiritual realm. A kingdom that's not of this world. And help that understanding to shape and mold how we view ourselves and our interaction with the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody. And you over to our host.